Turn the mic on. This is our intro music.
Yeah, they're danger. You just have to play Danger Zone at the end of this podcast. That's what's going to have to happen.
Tony apparently coming live from the tarmac at Andrews Air Force Base.
I'm coming to you live from the invasion of Venezuela.
Welcome to Second Breakfast. It's Friday, September 19th.
Can you smell the jet exhaust?
Keep it unmiked. This is our warm up.
This is our lo-fi music to podcast too.
Can anybody spin up Rock You Like a Hurricane so we can get the full air show experience?
I know Tony wanted to talk about the rise and fall of the GOP Hawks.
So in the last couple of weeks, there were a couple articles from Substacker Secretary of Defense Rock about the rise and fall of China Hawks in DC. And this is, based on a number of things. I think it just came out yesterday with the $400 million of the administration in aid to Taiwan that they kicked back because they want to get a trade deal with China. There's, obviously the fact that there's not really many China Hawks left in government. Most have went to China's tech, or they went back to the think tank world or have just fallen off the face of the earth. And so, basically the argument in post was, one, was this inevitable? Two, was the intent really for, especially GOP Hawks, was it always just a game and never ever real? I say someone who was on the Hill doing China policy at, what was probably the peak of effective, legislative, true American government, policy making, for China. There's a lot more nuance to it. Like I broadly agree with, are there any GOP Hawks left? Pretty much no. They're certainly, not government or they don't have power. Bipartisan wise, it's probably not really much there anymore. But I think there's some nuance that's missed. The first part being that there were in fact real Hawks who truly believed in the cause and are doing good work. They were far and few between. And I don't think that they were as skeptical of their colleagues' motives and interests in the policies they should have been. I think that was failing number one. I think failing number two was that there was never a strong bipartisan consensus on China. There was weak consensus in some areas when it was politically convenient. I wrote this in a couple years ago, and where did all the China Hawks go? Basically saying that the China problem is not one of blue versus red, but it's of various interests competing against one another, where you have commercial interests competing with national security interests, you have human rights interests competing with nativist and nationalist interests. So there's just, it's hard to get a big enough tent to really drive China policy anymore. And the remaining voices that you might think of that drove China policy between 2017 and, say 2023, which was Mike Gallagher, Matt Turpin, Rod Sterstein, Matt Potcher, like they're all out of government, right? And a lot of other national security leaders had grown up, for 20 years prior, doing nothing but global war on terror or doing Russia, and so they were focused on everything but fire. And they really didn't understand it. A lot of them would fall back to the same old, democratize them without any effort, which is the same word. After Canada, which didn't work. After WTO, which didn't work. And so I think, saying that the Dems were always willing to, saying that the GOP was willing to play ball on China, on fighting China was wrong because a lot of shoe folks were willing to do it. Most just saw it as convenience. Most were interested far more in domestic policy things. I think I mentioned this on a podcast before of more staffers were interested in banning foreigners from owning farmland than they were with actual counterintelligence concerns. Or building out the military in the force for the Pacific. And then, the other side of it being, I still encountered Dem staffers who were like, you can't say Taiwan in the NDAA, right? Unless we say so. It's too controversial. And then I think that all culminated around August of 22, even before the China Committee, when, we had that dust up, when some might call it, the fourth Taiwan Strait crisis or mini crisis over Pelosi going to Taiwan. And it was clear that there was no universal to on China, let alone Taiwan. So, is China hawkishness dead? No, but it is in coma. But it's not necessarily just all about whether, there were in fact folks in the GOP and in the Dems who truly did not do the fight because they lost.
it's interesting to think back to January of 2025, and I very vividly recall every single corporate communication that was aimed at the incoming administration say that you need to support my company because we are going to beat China. So there was, I think, a real expectation that going into this new administration, China hawk like rhetoric and sort of US versus China competition would be something that worked in talking to this administration. And remember, we had Mike Waltz, who I think Tony would put in the bucket of like people who actually cared about this. Marco Rubio, who, has spent his entire career like railing on communist Cuba and communist China as the sort of like operating words and the operating lodestar of what he doesn't like about the planet. And then, Eldridge Colby as the sort of like Svengali behind the scenes that for whatever you think about his policies, his book was oriented around denying China a path to sort of deciding the 21st century. It's like it comes down to the president's revealed preferences, and we saw in Trump 1 a handful of folks in the first few years who were really into it, and then things were by 2019 had kind of flattened out between the U.S. and China, and all of a sudden then COVID happens, and then that changes the sort of political reality. So. My only take is a forward-looking one that, 3.5 years is still a long time. And like lots of things could happen to congeal a different viewpoint inside Trump's head that will then kind of like filter out towards his administration and Congress. So I'm not entirely convinced that the sort of like reconciliation forward vision of selling chips to China and doing a TikTok deal and wanting to go to Beijing. This is all like the arc that played out in 2017, right? He had a big whole state visit and whatnot, and then it kind of ramped up over time. So I think it's still TBD, and coma is maybe is the right phrasing as opposed to death, because things happen in the world which changes the politics around these sorts of things.
Like, you can love like neo-isolationism as much as you want. You can choose to try to focus on anything else. End of the day, like there are things that we have, there are things that we do that the Chinese do not like. And at some point that friction becomes overwhelming, and they see advantage and they make a decision, right? Like there's, that I think that's the worst part is it's not like the 70s where we were suddenly, quasi friends with the Chinese against the Russians, right? We've just, went to a coma. And so the other guy's, still playing ball in a way that, requires more from us from the policy community. And so that's what I think what worries me the most. It's not that everyone had to change of heart. It's just us.
Well, the moment of China hawkery, if you want to call it that, withering, is downstream from liberal internationalism dying. It's not just a reversion to the mean around China and whether or not it's worth fighting for the liberty of Taiwan. From 1945 to 1948, there was this really ugly sorting of borders in Europe and South Asia and elsewhere, followed by decolonialization. And there was this collective assumption that the United States sort of girded that borders would only shift with consent of the shifted, so to speak. And that set of ideas has become partisan in the American context, and it's become unpopular. The tests that the United States has already failed around Palestinian nationalism and the Ukrainian War of Independence. And in 2024, there was a national election with two distinct visions on the way that the world should work. And the idea of the United States committing itself or putting its military in a position to defend the principles of liberal internationalism lost somewhat decisively. And the GOP is distinct from that 70-year tradition. So the idea of going to war against a peer adversary or another great power over what the Colbys of the world consider a breakaway province is kind of logical absurdity. And that's one component, it's one plank rather, that we're seeing put into a broader structure of a different kind of America. Kind of like, it doesn't fall into one of Walter Russell Mead's neat constructs of Hamiltonianism or Wilsonianism. It's something distinct. It's closer to like what Jefferson Davis had in mind for the Confederacy, in which the United States is aggressive in its backyard. It is indifferent to the troubles that the world witnesses overseas, and it isn't isolationist. It is reflexively violent, but for kind of parochial means. And it is difficult to align a bipartisan approach against the People's Republic of China or embrace a Manhattan Project for AI or truly invest in the defense industrial base with eyes towards sustaining conflict in the Western Pacific. If you're conducting covert action against the Maduro regime, or if you're doing covert influence operations against NATO members, or if you're threatening annexation of a longtime ally and trade partner and a central cultural friend or cousin of the United States. There's a spirit that I think is represented in the GOP where this is all okay. This is the new normal, and this is the way that countries are supposed to behave. And that a sense of strategic altruism, as demonstrated through basing rights in Japan or putting forward deployed divisions in the Fulda Gap or holding the Warsaw Pact at bay in West Germany, are relics of an Asian era. And the Trump team, when they speak with the greatest amount of precision, and I think it's people like Peter Navarro and the vice president who do this, I think they're truly committed to it. They say, we are in a new era and we're going to behave differently. And ultimately, whether or not Taiwan rise and falls or the Donbass rise and falls, those are matters for other people. So it's difficult to be a hawk in this moment. And when you go on stage, you give a lengthy speech about strategic competition over AI, it sounds like you're forecasting the secession of the Hohenzollerns or some Prussian Junker. It's like referring back to peculiarities of 3 centuries ago, not anything that's contemporarily going to move American voters, move the Senate, or change the national security prerogatives of the Trump administration. It's just a different world, and we are all downstream from it.
Yeah, and I think Eric, you and I have talked about this, about like what is the alternative vision that is required to propose to get us out of coma. Is something that like I think you and I could probably articulate, or I actually kind of like I don't all the way, but Secretary of Defense Rock, to his point, does say it's 150% tax for billionaires, 155 millimeter for autocrats. That's the foreign policy related. I don't know if that's entirely it. I definitely wouldn't play well with most of the American populace. But it is kind of like you have to choose between liberalism and autocracy. And how do you frame that in a way that aligns with the American nation? That sounds more like rejuvenation than it does like poo-pooing the past.
There's a fair disposition that I think the American right has embraced in the past decade or so, of like free rider effect. That there's this how do you want to put it, like a strategic eye roll towards like Angela Merkelism of Germany saying, well, we don't have to matter. The world is solved. The Americans will bail us out. We can buy natural gas from Russia, and Gerhard Schroeder will make sure that the prices are fair. that I think there's a fair reconciliation that national security oriented Americans and politicians, advocates, think tankers, you name it, or people like us who are commenting on it, have to recognize that the United States did enable a free rider effect of sorts. And it's not just NATO divesting their operational capacity. It's manifested in some of the commentary that we witnessed from the Houthi campaign earlier this year, when all of the luminaries of the Trump administration got on Signal with Jeff Goldberg and decided to talk about the, strikes against the Houthis. And I mentioned it a couple of minutes ago. The vice president chimed in and said, "Hey, this is a essential sea lane for global trade. Where are the Europeans? Why are we bringing out our knives once more on behalf of the global commons when the Mediterranean is right there and it's American sailors and Marines who are in positions of danger?" It's a fair criticism. And I think Americans who are sort of feeling like Roadrunner right now, that you're sprinting along a direction in the 2018 National Defense Strategy. If, hey, we're going to orient against the big four threats and we're going to consider ourselves in an era of strategic competition, we're going to take the Russians, the North Koreans, the Iranians, and the People's Republic of China seriously. And you believe that and you set conditions for it and you move out on it for 7 years. And then all of a sudden you look beneath you and you recognize that there's no ground there. And I don't mean to go through an exercise in Red Guard style self-criticism. I'm not going to write a note and share it so it could be effectively purged. But yeah, I was part of the problem because, I spent a lot of time learning Arabic and figuring out the proclivities of various deputy assistant secretaries of defense. And I did not spend any time trying to speak with like marginal voters in Oneida County where I grew up who just don't give a flying fuck about any of it. And when they do decide to dial into it, they're like, well, why are NATO members paying 0.9% of their GDP? Or like the Greeks who say they're doing 4%, but 3.8% of that is pensions. I mean, and I don't mean to be disrespectful. I mean, there's good Greek units and everything, but we are operating in a moment where I think contemporary liberalism, the professional managerial class that's oriented towards national security, had a bluff called on them, not just by the GOP, but by most American voters. And they didn't necessarily back the turn to authoritarianism, but they said, the United States being the guarantor of the global commons didn't mean much to them. And advocates like myself, or people who, I don't think I coasted on it because, I put myself in positions of danger on its behalf a couple of times. But for someone who's got all of these decorations behind me in a room full of war games and other mementos of this period, it does feel sort of like I just bought a pair of clown shoes. And for the first time in November 2024, people like J.D. Vance pointed out, hey, your shoes are kind of goofy. And I get to spend the next few years of my life reconciling that because, I didn't look under me to figure out that I was the Roadrunner sprinting, or I was Wile E. Coyote sprinting, and the Roadrunner had pulled another trick on me.
I think it's interesting just to kind of even divorce it from some of the actual national security talk and just look at it from like, we talk about the free rider effect. I think to some degree, U.S. industry also kind of put us in this position because what we had in the free rider effect was, you read Apple in China and you see the decisions that were made to move production and like put it into these verticals where you've made, the world's, at the time wealthiest company, but it's basically built on the back of Foxconn and the ability to squeeze labor and efficiencies out of the Chinese marketplace. I think we were talking about it earlier, the Meta glasses that are coming out. I think the company, if I remember right, it's a Chinese company that's doing a lot of the manufacturing on one of their vision things. They ripped them off and started producing them, and Meta had no choice but to just like go, man, we really wish you wouldn't do that, because they were the only company that at margin cost could produce the lenses that they needed. And so like what we were asking from a national security standpoint was, it kind of goes back to that Australian clip that I shared, where like, so you want us to spend $800 billion securing our lines of trade with against China, and our lines of trade are with China. It's like we kind of backed ourselves into that corner, and it does become very hard to reconcile. We've spent so much time deeply integrating and bought into the theory that open liberal exchange and touch points with capitalist America would cause the PRC to change or to even collapse, and they would become more like us. That didn't happen, and I think that was actually the first bluff call, because once that kind of plank in the liberal order argument falls, everything else was kind of built and bedrocked on that. And so when that didn't happen, it becomes like, okay, so what is the rest of the argument for why we should be preparing against, or doing these strategic things against China? I don't know. A person who spent a lot of time doing the counterterrorism thing, the end state of like Iraq and Afghanistan obviously was very amorphous. The idea of we're going to go get bad guys is something that's very easy to sell. I think, yeah, much harder to sell. Hey, we're going to take a humongous hit to our GDP and basically force everybody back into, the 1960s economy, so that we can battle our strategic partner or rival. I don't know. It's interesting, and it's kind of deflating a little bit.
I just wanted to emphasize that book is stunning. Apple in China. If you're a listener, you should absolutely go through it. It will shift the way that you think of one of America's most iconic companies. And my key takeaway from it is that we have witnessed like an open embrace of authoritarianism from certain American tech giants. Like that is absolutely happening. And YouTube is a vector for radicalization, or social media. But the American company that most aggressively bought in with international authoritarianism was Apple. And we're all downstream from that. And every strategic concern that we elevate is part of the environment that Apple created. The entire CHIPS Act is all of that, $68 billion of grants, loans, and tax incentives was like 1.5 years of capital expenditure that Apple put into China in like 2015 and onward. It is truly an excellent read.
I mean, if China really does actually ban NVIDIA, that will be a fascinating development, because, okay, the center of gravity from, 2005 to 2022 was probably Apple. And the center of gravity for the sort of tech future now is NVIDIA. And if Jensen really becomes shut out, just like, Google and Meta got shut out, then the sort of all the money and weight and energy from a political economy standpoint that he and his firm have will be shifted in a different direction. And, like if I was Jensen today, I wouldn't necessarily be sure that it's permanent, right? And even when and sort of Google and Facebook had to go through an arc of like, oh, maybe they'll let us back in, and you had Project Dragonfly, and Zuckerberg asking Xi to name his daughter and all this stuff. But like at a certain point, I think Zuckerberg is aware that like it's not gonna happen for him the way it and he's not gonna have, he's never gonna have the arc in China that like that a Tesla did. So TBD on whether China is truly pulling the plug on buying NVIDIA hardware, or whether once Trump opens up to selling better racks, then that changes the domestic political calculus in China. But I want to come back to that, like, Justin point of, global war on terror actually a salient thing for voters. And there's kind of some like half-life decay thing, right? Where 9/11 happens, and that's a big enough deal that it gets two wars started that, like, by and large, I think we're polling at like 65% or something when they started, at least. And we haven't had something that kind of like cut through and resonated. And COVID is like, I mean, it's not really like, it's not like at one level it's like China's fault, but it's not like the Chinese government. It's not like China, like no one has like convincingly proved that this was like a Chinese government bioweapon to like,
Well, and,
like screw over the world or something, right?
I don't know. I had a nurse
50%
at
of the
Fort Carson who was tending to me for some medical reason, who insisted that it was a Chinese bioweapon that was keeping me down. Fascinating conversation.
Also, it'd be a pretty shitty bioweapon if it like ended up killing a few million of your own people and shutting off,
yeah, absolutely.
taking this enormous bite out of domestic GDP. So, anyways, but no, like there hasn't been a salient thing. There hasn't been a Cuban Missile Crisis or a Berlin crisis or a or an invasion of Czechoslovakia. I mean, it's the sort of all the dangers are still very much in the abstract, and they're slow and creeping. And there's deindustrialization is like one factory at a time. It's not like a salient.
Yeah.
I think the expanded invasion of Ukraine was that moment. I mean, it's far worse than Hungary or moving to Czechoslovakia, or even arguably the original Soviet moves into Afghanistan. The issue that we have is a shattered media environment where you can have former members of the House of Representatives say, well, actually, this invasion makes sense because there are bio labs throughout Ukraine that the Russians are just trying to inspect. And by the way, are you aware of the Azov Battalion?
I don't think it's a shattered media environment. I think it's a president that didn't buy in. And if there were, or a presidential candidate at the time that didn't buy in, if there was
back in 2022.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think pretty quickly, like there was a Putin pilled, like if Trump wasn't around, I think the sort of Putin pilled slice of the GOP wouldn't have had nearly as much play as they did.
So a couple of things on that. One of which is that I think people talk about like the fall of Kabul or the Russian invasion of 22, the effect of 22, as individual events, but in a 365 day, you have fall of Kabul, you have the invasion of Ukraine, and then you have the Taiwan crisis, August of 22, right? Mm-hmm. That is three major national security events where the first one says the American people wakes up to the war they've been ignoring for 10 years. And, I watched, I was on the bureaucratic side trying to ship people out of Kabul. I watched half of members of Congress just not pick up their phone when the constituents are calling or when problem, right? We have the State Department saying, hey, that's not my job. Or representatives for the Secretary of Defense saying, that's not my lane. Like those were personal interactions that I had that drove me up. February 22 happened. We know it's going to happen for like months on end. And, we wait until the last moment to actually, get things into place. The world kind of rallies around it. At the same time, in January of 22, I have senior GOP staffers ask me reasonably what percentage of party do you think is done in by Russian disinformation? And then I have, in August of 22, you basically have most of the bureaucracy that had been involved in the China game, with the exception of like the military boss, going, oh, whoa, didn't mean nothing by it. I thought this was just about technology. I thought this was a technology competition. I didn't know they wanted to hurt us. And I think that's when the backpedaling really begins. So there's like that three-phase approach within 365 days where really foreign policy begins to change first.
Yeah, and we were pretty flat-footed, right? Like the Ukraine invasion. I mean, honestly, like there were some attempts by the Biden administration to signal what was going to happen, but like there were absolutely people, and my memory is serving me correctly, even within Ukraine, that were dismissing the possibility of an invasion.
Zelensky was very aggressively 10 days prior to the launch of the offensive against Kyiv. He was saying this wasn't going to happen. It was Boris Johnson who stole a march on the United States and got anti-tank rockets into the hands of Ukrainian units around the capital. Like, it was not this unified front by any means.
Yeah. And I think that's where, again, like the hawks kind of across the board, they were already dissolving at that point pretty precipitously. because we were seeing a switch. And I think to Jordan's point, like you had the leading candidate that we knew was going to be the leading candidate in the next election, who had already basically said, this wouldn't have even happened if I had been in office. Like it would have been a non-starter. And to be honest, the energy of the Biden administration by that time, and especially in the response to Afghanistan, was if you had told me he was already on the Woodrow Wilson bed in the White House, I would have been like, yep, that makes sense. Like,
Yeah. And there was this segment of authentic, hey, we've got to support the Ukrainian national movement. Like that was a component of what was happening. But then there was this briefcase carrier spirit of everybody put on their Herman Kahn hat and say, well, now we're in the business of escalation management, and we're going to provide the Ukrainians certain anti-tank missiles, but not certain anti-air missiles. And rather than the sense of, hey, let's win the war becoming a collective spirit, it was, let's canalize the violence in a way that is acceptable to the parties to the conflict. And that resulted in the Ukrainians receiving a substantial amount of material support, but there was never a moment of, hey, this is an existential threat that has to be stopped. It was, here is a non-lethal cancer that has to be managed. And that's not an absurd disposition. It's not grounded in science fiction as opposed to reality. Like you can have a sober approach and say, hey, we don't want to provoke the Russians into a wider war. That's okay, but that disposition also lost credibility as the Ukrainians began to escalate and use a greater variety of tools in their war, and the Russians did not counter. So the response, and I think it was absolutely witnessed downstream from Kabul, appeared to be a muddle. And it wasn't like this decisive response that the United States roused Europe to respond to Russian aggression. That appearance wasn't taken by American voters. I think it was seen as a string of humiliations from Kabul to Ukraine to Gaza Pier.
I mean, one thing that's interesting, I think this will tie back into the other thing that I think we were going to talk about today with the NDAA, is even to some degree the way that we talked about what we were giving to Ukraine and how we restricted even how they could employ some of the things that we gave to them kind of ties to the way they have worded the Taiwan Security Cooperation Initiative. And like, yeah, I think in the new NDAA, they talked about widening it. But like even then, they're widening it to include like combat casualty care and medical equipment and things like that. They're not widening it to talk about like, you know, the types of munitions and the abundance that we have talked about that would be necessary to boil the ocean or boil the strait or whichever euphemism you want to use for enable Taiwanese defense. But I don't know if we wanted to start talking about the NDAA at all.
Who doesn't love a in-depth conversation about an omnibus defense bill?
You know,
I'm
Eric,
thrilled.
we're trying to make policy cool for people who,
Yeah.
as I wrote in an article, think going to ignorant for TF-17 is fast as coded. I guess I'll kick it off explaining the basics of the NDAA, because I think a lot of people get this confused in kind of where the future looks like. So the National Defense Authorization Act is basically the massive policy bill that Congress passes every year. It's kind of the one thing that for the longest time, it's not inherently a GWAT-ism, but it's definitely ran in parallel to that of like, this is the thing we have to do every year if we do nothing else. And so the way it works is that, let's say let's start with a budget of a new administration, right? So the administration will put out a new budget. They're supposed to in March. Yes, usually they get to in April or May. But regardless, Congress goes starting about January, February. They talk to lobbyists, they talk to countries, they talk to everybody else, and they say, "What do you need based upon last year?" Right? And so all of these discussions are had for several months. People make policy recommendations, sometimes obvious in the language. If you're a good staffer, you write your own. And you don't just take, you don't just pick and choose from the lumber and the concrete industries. You write good policy, which is a rarity and what we want to advocate for on this podcast. Regardless, at this point, it's around March or April is where it starts to diverge because on one hand, you have the appropriations committees that do the budgeting, and then you have the NEA under the armed services committees that do the policy. And so one of the things that they did way back when, which several people, including like Mike Gallagher, have argued for, is that you should combine the appropriations, or you should take away the appropriations committees and put them back into the policy committees, because you have the NDA only authorizes funding, but the appropriations committees can totally ignore that, right? It's a guideline, not a law. And so the appropriations committees can say, hey, cool, like your idea. We're going to ignore that because we don't like the way the Air Force spelled out SF6. So, so that's basically when people talk about NDA, it is not the budget, vice versa, right? Now sometimes you can use the NDA to like basically say like, hey, this is extra weight. The NDA authorized it, but you should also fund this in ropes, but not always the case. Anyway, the NDA, massive policy bill. The House and Senate are slightly different the way that they handle this. The House will vote on it. On the subcommittees, so every groups of policies set in the subcommittees, right? They vote on those packages, those go into a bigger bill. Then it gets argued out in the committee room, usually until about 1 or 3 a.m. So tremendous historic experience and curial staff are used to it. The problem is that the House does it in the open. So you get to watch this live on C-SPAN for if you're a nerd. But in the Senate, they do it behind closed doors. Now the Senate will argue they have to do that because they have to get their bill 60 votes instead of 51. And the House can pass with a majority. Not all of us are as positive. Not all of us positively view the Senate as the proper righteous chamber of Congress. So anyway, when things like this get debated, and you'll see like, oh, there was an amendment added to the NDA bill, et cetera. There's several phases of that, and sometimes people will put things in bills basically as cannon fodder, right? So you'll see crazy stuff get thrown in there because they expect the other side to do crazy stuff. Basically, they'll be like, okay, cool. If you take that out, I'll take this out. And if they disagree, then it gets escalated to like the chairman and ranking member, and then to like kind of the big four in the House and Senate, right? If they want to take it that far, or they'll just take it off the table. So anyway, after it leaves committee, then all of the normies in Congress can have their pick at the bill and debate and say like defense should be cut 10%, no, defense should be raised 20%, all these ridiculous things. And this whole process is about 9 months to a year long. It is the most arduous process on Capitol Hill, but it's also the one that has the most amount of impact on defense policy, perhaps probably U.S. government policy very large, because it usually covers other national security things. Sometimes non-national security stuff gets thrown in there. I had many a weekend ruined by a weed banking bill from a member from Colorado. Honestly, very nice old man, but ruined many of the guests because he wanted to insert some stuff in there. That's the basics of the NDA. We'll talk about the 25-26 kind of here, but yeah, if you guys want to talk about your experiences with Phil Stafford through the NDA, and then what your outlook is.
Is the official change from Department of Defense to Department of War in the text, at least in the current version?
Not in the one that I've seen. The most recent, I didn't see that.
Interesting.
Yeah. I was kind of caught by the fact that they were already talking about, or not that they were already talking about, but they talked about relatively significant troop increases in the Army and the Navy, or I guess troop and sailor, however you want to term it. But I don't know where they're going to get those people from. Just because we've had a little bit of a recruiting increase, but there hasn't been enough to make me think that you're going to get 12,000 additional, soldiers and I forget, say 11,000 additional sailors in uniform and on ships over the next year. I don't know what increase
up to 5.2% that we get.
that does track. So
it is a perfectly direct.
Don't people want to cut their beards short and not get tattoos? What are our new regs?
Our new grooming standards for the warrior spirit.
Yeah, the new hair length in the Army is 2 inches.
Yeah.
Which I did not meet, except for basic training and Ranger school the entire time I was in the Army. So
say it's two for the Army. It's 2 inches up top and 1 on the side, and 2 inches short up top. 1 on the side is kind of long, I think. maybe I don't see it like that. So like, I don't know if that's the pro 45-year-old vote that you're getting there with, just the bald stuff you got left.
I mean, how are they going to recruit for the innovator detachment and park tech execs as lieutenants colonel if they are doing haircuts? I mean,
No,
You
I
get-
think
It's not very
they
warrior
want
spirit
the
of them.
warrior spirit. No, that's the whole thing. This is
that's-
what you
Yeah.
can't
But Eric-
cosplay unless you dress the part.
But you know
That's
what?
right.
Eric brings up a really good point because this is something we talked about a lot when we were talking about, bringing in tech people or people who had experience with hacking and coding and things like that. Like, were the regulations for enlistment a barrier to entry? And that's everything from, obviously drug use, where it's becoming
mental
legal
health
in more and more
consultation.
states. Yeah, mental health consultation. The fact that athletes, like high school athletes who get concussions or have like broken bones, which are, natural parts of being athletes, and or the thing that you think you want to kind of select for if you're looking for people to join the armed forces, they're kind of already through the MHS Genesis process that brings them in their medical review. They're kind of they're already disqualified. But then, like, let's say we want to go into these more tech focused areas where you don't need to be the guy that's running and gunning and you don't have to be in the best shape. Again, to somewhat Eric's point, like, man, increasing the regulations on those people, unless there's other pathways to bring them in as civilians where they can be civilian augmentees to the Defense Department or Department of War or whatever we're going to call it. It does bring up a question just because there's just always been a lot of conversation around that. Like, how do you get those skill sets in that we think we're going to need to where they'll contribute and they want to be there?
Sorry to be another like humanism, but it's like for 20 years you had army check, but everybody started off basically no front time is plan of a future, right? That was the stereotype. I have several friends who are good officers who did that, but still. And so it's like, okay, well, those are the people who remained in. And so like, what do you, I mean, which culture are they going to be more comfortable with? Is it going to be that one or the one that's based off of that? Which one do they feel less threatened by?
Yeah. Like I said, I just think it is an interesting point as you shift towards some of those. But yeah, that gets, again, the Manning issue. I see it kind of one issue. Another issue is like this inculcation of like the VC mentality that is kind of going within the department, where I would love to get Tony's take on this and Eric's take on this, but are we building a drone bubble within the defense tech industry with the way that we're approaching the way the department's giving out money and resources now?
I mean, I'll defer to Eric's experience on like what VC numbers look like in terms of how much. I mean, you have to invest to get a certain amount of return. And I mean, I'll say to your point, like we're still doing manpower increases, right? Like from a what is effective about GNP? I would say that there would be a defense policy side bubble where suddenly you're like, we don't need infrastructure, right? The integration being a different story, and you can say, well, maybe the tactics are wrong, right? That's fine. But I think still there's still enough people in the department who are still like, yeah, there's a way to do this, but it's not about replacement. It's about inspiration. No matter what the branding says otherwise.
So for 10 years now, at least 10 years, the department has been looking to Silicon Valley as a means of correcting like sclerosis of acquisitions. The Defense Innovation Unit, experimental, transitioning to DIU itself, the creation of the 75th Innovation Command, the Marine Innovation Unit, Naval X, transitioning into a newly founded Navy Rapid Capabilities Office, the Office of Strategic Capital, and now the FUSE program at the Army, just to name a few. And those are just the survivors. Like there was a Army Venture Capital Corporation for a little while that, to Tony's point, was authorized but never funded, so it didn't technically happen. And it all represents a form of like, I don't know, cargo cultism or underpants gnomes theory, that you embrace this concept of rapid iteration for software as a service providers or fintech providers that's born out of Silicon Valley. And somehow you're going to improve warfighting outcomes. And it is a sufficient answer that is spoken of as a necessary one. That, not to turn a conversation into a logic game, but I don't think that the services or the Department of Defense have ever really thought critically about what they're trying to achieve through this process, because ultimately, they want faster acquisition timelines. That's perfectly fine. That you need to reform acquisitions. You have to go after the federal acquisition regulation. You have to go after the defense supplement. You have to go after the contractors, the warrant holders. The entire edifice has to be shifted, and you have to energize those processes and make them move faster and compel them to move at the speed of the market. And we're seeing, it's not just like Fuse at the Army or bringing in a bunch of tech people and making them lieutenant colonel for some reason. It's like at OUSD, Office of the Undersecretary of Defense for Research Engineering, the Undersecretary, Emil Michael's like, I want AI at everybody's desk in 6 to 9 months. Okay, you're giving everybody a method, but what are you trying to improve? What's the actual impact that you're trying to achieve? I was just at R&E for 2 years, and I recall we had a GS-15 hire who came onto my team, and he was there for about 6 months, and he kept on saying, hey, I'm getting up to speed. And I witnessed his supervisor do his time card for him. AI doesn't fix that. AI doesn't cure a process of hiring of people who come into jobs and just don't really give a flying fuck over whether they achieve anything that week or they just show up. We had, I saw a deputy director of a program who was sort of strutting to the office around 11:30, chat, do a lot of glanding, and then punch out around 4. And, people are like, wow, this guy's great. And you're like, AI doesn't cure that. And these are people who are in positions of responsibility for massive federal spending programs. And I could just go down a substantial list. I recognize that it's anecdotal, but I'm a mid to late career professional at this point who's sitting at the Pentagon, and I see people who just routinely don't check their email. Like, they just don't consider it part of their responsibilities to engage with the material of their office. They are there to chat. They are there to talk. They are there to talk SEC football. Like, that is their job. And talking and implementing like a Fuse process, or making sure everybody has AI at their desks, or putting on vests and your dress sneakers and talking about innovation, it doesn't matter if there is a lack of strategic direction, if accountability is a remote feature of your office. I mean, I was at a program that is now a $200 billion spending ticket, and we had a supervising official who worked remotely, and that's fine, but the flash to bang time of him getting a policy question and him providing a response to us was typically about 6 weeks. He just didn't give a fuck. And pardon the language, I recognize this is supposed to be like a family-friendly podcast. I'm a little frustrated about it because...
You are a child-friendly war podcast. Thank you very much.
Yeah, somebody's going to listen to this. But
child soldiers, those they matter too.
But I'll wind down this reflection with these are people who are brought in as HQEs, and they just wander around like a child who's lost in a movie theater, and they don't ask for direction. And if you try to compel them to work, well, actually, you're shaking them down. You're a hassle. You're a hater. You're not letting them innovate. Just to give you one example, I was at my previous employer for about 2 days, and we were operating off of the Google Suite. And I use Gmail for all my personal stuff, and it's fantastic. But who doesn't use that is like financial institutions, law firms. And I had just left Silicon Valley. I had done scores and scores of Safe Notes, Series A's, you name it. And it's just like one of the constant features of this was taking startups, getting them off of Google and putting them onto a traditional document management system that would just formalize our processes. So it was just normal. This was just what Silicon Valley did. And then I get out to DC with a bunch of people who think that they're doing Silicon Valley. And I'm like, hey, this system kind of, it really sucks. Like, it knocks all the formatting out of your documents and you can't do version control. And they're just like, hey man, you just don't get innovation. Why are you hating on it? And I just found out this week that a little more than 2 years after I first raised it, I got told to go to hell. The new management of my former office, a bunch of actual investors, people who come from actual funds, came in and said, immediately, get rid of this. This is ridiculous. Why are you doing this? And it's the difference between people who play act venture capitals. They put on the vest, they put on the dress sneakers, they walk around, they chat about all the deals that they think they're making. And then you actually come into contact with someone who has actually run some M&A transactions, and they snap their fingers and say, okay, we're actually going to execute at this point. So my collective thought here is that all of the implementation that the Department of Defense is trying to employ, of borrowing from Silicon Valley, is a lot of play acting and dress up. When ultimately what these teams need to drive acquisitions faster, to make smart investments, to be responsible stewards of taxpayer policy, is just minor accountability measures. Make people check their email. Expect them to show up to work. Then layer in AI and figure out what you're going to do with it.
So
I
is
mean,
I was just saying, is
Go
the
ahead, Tom.
play actor the cousin of the briefcase carrier, and what is eventually going to become a very large ecosystem chart that Eric is going to create for us?
I swear, like there is a culture of people in DC who have, like, they've stayed over to Hampton in a couple, 2-3 times. They put on Shark Tank because it's always on CNBC, and they get very comfortable talking about 10% stakes in equity for under $50,000 for your cupcake shop. I mean, Mr. Wonderful changed the world by investing in ready-made cupcakes, and you could just spray on this culture. And they wear it like a bright orange tan, and they think they're just like these legendary investors when you actually go back into the history of what they achieved. And you recognize that they haven't updated their password in 180 days because it's just, they are elected, they are hired to lead, not to read.
It's funny because you also see it like just in the way that things are starting to get phrased now. You're starting to see it's gone from, man, these 5-year palm cycles are way too long. Like we got to speed it up. And then they've gotten in, and now it's like, wow, these 20-year time spans are way too long. And it's like, well, guys, I thought we were trying to get it below the 5-year span. If we've expanded the target to, we just want to get something within 20 years, like traditional defense acquisitions did that. Not always well, but they did it. Like, I don't understand like what the VC, like I said, the circular logic that kind of goes around with some of
they
that.
think that if a prime touches it, it sucks. I mean, that it's just, it's a logical fallacy. Like the LRASM is a amazing tool of contemporary warfare. The F-35, while iterative, is being successfully employed in numerous combat operations internationally. Like the major end items that the United States military employs are not the problem. The problem is often a lack of strategic vision and strategic direction, and giving units the ability to achieve their political objectives. And instead, rather than reconciling with maybe a broken national security decision-making process, the NDAA structure, the national defense strategies lying to ourselves, we've got gizmo culture, where all we need is another UAS overhead or another subsea submersible that's operating independently. We need decision science because the gizmos are going to bail us out for our own inability to speak and think clearly. That's our crisis right now. Like I feel like we're the Royal Navy in 1914 and think like, hey, we've got the steel, we've got the gunnery tables, we know how to engage our targets. We will be fine. And we love our gizmos, and we're missing what's beneath the surface of the North Sea.
I think it's a really good comparison. I think to circle this back to how that relates then to policy, you're trying to do it, is that, for years, as we've said before, like, your arms sustaining rates finished, arms sustaining rates for machine guns, these extreme things. That whole tech doesn't work. We build less, so we do not allocate funds for properly resourcing our strategic objectives. And I think the British are an excellent example of this, of that, the British had the best Navy in the world, and then they had, I think the total was 6 regular Army divisions on the island, on the main Isles in 1914. It was at 4 and 2 territorial. I don't remember the numbers, but they were in no way prepared for what everyone expected since at least like 1909 to be a ground-based continental conflict.
Yeah, their entire foreign policy from like the Air Crow memorandum forward was, hey, we should just secure Belgian neutrality. Like their NDS version said, we are going to commit ourselves to a balance of power fight in Europe. And they've still got regiments of lancers walking around, galloping.
I think to talk about it from the U.S. perspective too, I think one of the interesting things is when when Task Force 947 or when 947 and Task Force 9 were in Syria, there was a certain point, probably around 2017, 2018, where like bean counters in the Pentagon started to call down, and they were like, "Hey, you guys are firing too many 120 millimeter mortars. Like you've depleted the stock. You got to stop." What that did not trigger at that point was, "Hey, we need to make more of these." It triggered getting mad at the people on the ground and telling them they need to do less, which of course did not go over at all. The colonel from the Pentagon, I'm pretty sure, got yelled at by everybody that was from the person who received that phone call all the way up through, the chief of staff of the army. But it's just one of those things where it's like, when people were talking about like, oh, well, in Ukraine, we started to see the depletion. We already knew that there was depletion, that we did not have the production capacity to keep up when we really started expending rounds. And then that was not.
It was like the French, the Marines, they were melting artillery tubes in shaping operations for Mosul. Like,
absolutely.
The warning was there. Absolutely.
Yeah. And that's where what I would like to see, like, how does that feedback loop get pushed into the NDAA process where you actually see that? Because like the last couple of years, we've talked about re-energizing the industrial base, but outside of some relatively minor investments, like we haven't really seen significant push.
So there's still, and that's where I get to that delta between the appropriations and the armed services committees of like, and I've gotten arguments with this about former appropriations staffers. They're like, well, the military didn't do it the right way. And it's like, yes, man, but we're all here for the interest of national security. Could you maybe give them, some inline edits and say, hey, fix this, and not, oh, I'm just not going to respond because they missed a decimal point or something. It's whether you're more interested in punishing the Pentagon or, protecting American security. And I think a lot of, particularly on the approach committees, they forget that. The approach committee has this habit of still trying to also do policy. And you'll see that injector. Well, the committee feels, and it's like, no. First of all, it's the armed services job. Second of all, like your job is to make sure the numbers match up. You don't have the policy experts. You just don't. And that's really where that delta is. Even when they would talk to each other, the first year, General Berger wanted missiles for the Marine Corps littoral regiments. He learned his lesson because he went thinking he ropes and he would just sign off on it. Ropes to me, it's like, we don't know what the hell it's for. Zero them out. So, it would be a lot of painful processes there, and a lot of early 2020s. But yeah, like it is plenty with the appropriations committees. And it was just the approach committees who could handle it. But then you still have the other members and staffers who have their own agendas who are less interested in these things. It becomes enough of a majority against actually fixing these problems that they just don't get solved.
I have a child soldiers riff to close on. I don't know. If anyone else wants to say stuff, then we can go with that. But up to you guys.
No, I think that would be good.
Anyone have any comments about U.S. grant?
We've already referenced the Royal Navy enough, so you have to include child sailors as well.
This will be the first episode where if we don't talk about, I'm not even going to say what we're not going to talk about because it's the first one where we haven't talked about it. But
I'm so sorry because my child soldier story is actually a Civil War child soldier story.
We got it anyway.
So there's this book which I'm asking ChatGPT to recall the title of, but basically there was this transition over the course of the 19th and 20th centuries where being a child soldier was like the coolest thing you could do. And it was valorized, particularly in the Civil War, where, you'd have these like regiments of like dads fighting with their kids. And when the children die, fighting for the Union or Confederate cause, like they become lionized as these like martyr figures. Everyone wants their drummer boy, right?
Vigil strange, I kept that night. Yeah, the great Walt Whitman poem is all about that.
And kind of over the, this like becomes a less normalized thing. But for for much of human history, it was not a weird thing. It was kind of the cool thing to do, and then the sign that like there was something right with your society if you could get like a 14-year-old to want to go fight and die for your cause. Should we let's do a poetry reading, Eric? You wanna look that up? That's a nice thing to close on. Some pro-child soldiers.
To go for the full Walt Whitman of Vigil Strange.
We might be reading for a few minutes.
It is succinct. We'll see if Vigil Strange.
Okay.
I kept on the field one night when you, my son, my comrade, dropped at my side that day. One look I but gave, which your dear eyes returned with a look I shall never forget. One touch, your hand to mine, oh boy, reached up as he lay on the ground. Then onward I sped in battle, the even contested battle. Till late in the night, relieved to the place at last again I made my way. Found you in death, so cold, dear comrade. Found your body, son of responding kisses. Never again on earth responding. Bared your face in the starlight, curious the scene. Cool blew the moderate night wind. Long there, and then in vigil I stood. Dimly around me the battlefield spreading. Vigil wondrous and vigil sweet there in the fragrant, silent night. But not a tear fell, not even a long-drawn sigh. Long I gazed. Then on the earth, partially reclining, I sat by your side, leaning my chin in my hands, passing sweet hours, immortal and mystic hours, with you, dearest comrade. Not a tear, not a word. Vigil of silence, love and death. Vigil for you, my son and my soldier. As onward silently stars aloft, eastward new ones upward stole. Vigil final for you, brave boy. I could not save you, swift was your death. I faithfully loved you and cared for you living. I think we shall surely meet again. Till at least, lingering of the night, indeed, just as the dawn appeared. My comrade, I wrapped him his blanket, enveloped well his form, folded the blanket well, tucking it carefully overhead and carefully under feet, and there and then, bathed by the rising sun, my son in his grave, in his rude dug cave, I deposited, ending my vigil strange with that, vigil of night and battlefield dim, vigil for boy of responding kisses, never again on earth responding, vigil for comrade swiftly slain, vigil I never forget, how as day brightened, I rose from the chill ground and folded my soldier well in his blanket, and buried him where he fell.
Whew.
So the book I was thinking of is called Child Soldiers in the Western Imagination from Patriots to Victims. And it goes through how, in the Revolutionary War, War of 1812, Civil War, this is still a sort of noble and honorable thing. And then, into the 20th century, it becomes like a thing of horror, having, pubescent and prepubescent men running around with guns. We'll end it there. Thanks for being a part of Second Breakfast. Do we want to make a call out if there's any, cranky former Navy, Air Force, Marines folks out there who want to join in this? I feel like we could get a little bit more of a rotating cast. If you want to hang, send me a DM. We can figure it out.
Yeah.
We're going to start having guests too.
If somebody else wants to come in and recite Walt Whitman, they are welcome to take my seat.
We're doing Hamlet solo
actually,
next time. And
yeah.
just like a Grant Sherman saw it, where like one guy like heckles him and is like, is it Rever Shipper? Join us next time when we find somebody new or somebody's new to bully and make them recite either poetry or Civil War history.